Okay, ready, Cole?
Yes.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us. We are delighted to see you all. We're delighted to have our speakers with us. We're going to queue up this webinar with a few slides just to give an overview and an outline of what we're talking about in terms of rejecting AIPAC, and then queuing up our 4 speakers. So I'm going to share my screen. Cole, can you see that?
Yes, looks good.
So this is a webinar on rejecting AIPAC, the Israel Lobby, and the Democratic Party, with our 4 speakers, and I will introduce them in detail in a minute. But Ilan Pappe, historian; Rami G, journalist; Harris Gruman, SEIU State Council Director; and Garvey, the new Executive Director of MAPA. So many of you are familiar with this, this background of the question. For the centralizing question is why AIPAC, why us, and why now? You all know that AIPAC threatens our democracy by undermining progressive candidates and by promoting pro-Zionist candidates who do not support equal human and political rights for Palestinians and Israelis. So you've seen this information about that AIPAC spent over $100 million on the 2024 elections. It's incredible, right? And that they are the biggest source of GOP donations in the Democratic primaries. And what they have done is undermined progressive candidates that we support, like members of the Squad, whom you know, a group of progressive Black and brown lawmakers who were targeted by pro-Israel PACs like AIPAC after they criticized Israel's response to the October 7th attack by Hamas, and also, of course, even before October 7th. So you've seen this, that they helped unseat Jamal Bowman and Khouri Bush, and they're trying to target, I think, Rashida Tlaib. They haven't been successful so far. And the Squad has been outspoken in their support of a ceasefire, humanitarian right, equal rights, political rights for the Palestinians. This is from President Biden's 2024 State of the Union address. And they held up this sign. This image comes from C-SPAN, but I took the liberty of modifying it because they also held up these signs, but we didn't have the rights to share that image with you. It would have cost us $175 to pay Getty. So I just sort of edited the image a little bit, but they actually held up those signs. So the Squad are progressive members that AIPAC has undermined and continues to try to undermine. So the question is, why Massachusetts? Why are we working on this issue? Well, for one thing, AIPAC is the top contributor to both of these representatives, Catherine Clark and Jake Auchincloss in Newton. And so, you know, they're funding their campaigns.
Those toes are out.
Can we mute that?
Yes.
And in terms of why us, how are we positioned? We are well positioned to take this on because we have progressive legislators such as Jim McGovern and Ayanna Pressley. And we also have very progressive voters, which is you. It's all of us. And so we are positioned to take action on this. And why now? Why is it important now to take this on? You all know that AIPAC is part of a much bigger right-wing alignment. And they're the biggest barrier standing in the way of broad democratic support for equal rights for both peoples in Israel and Palestine. So for all of those reasons, we need to take them on. We have to take action now in advance of legislation that may be put forward in 2025. And as we strategize, as we think ahead for the 2026 election cycle in terms of their trying to undermine, again, progressive candidates in 2026. You know, if not now, is co-sponsoring this, this webinar. There may be other co-sponsors, but we adapted our goals based on their campaign. So the goal for 2024, as you see here, is to expose and undermine the US political forces that are standing in the way of a ceasefire and a long-term solution for all Palestinians and Israelis. We want to make AIPAC's agenda so politically toxic that they can't undermine our elections and pave a new way forward for holding Israel accountable and for ensuring equal rights for all Palestinians and Israelis. How will we know we've won? When conditioning US military aid is a prerequisite stance for progressive caucus members. And when the Democratic Party takes on, more accurately reflects us, its grassroots base, and governs in line with pro-ceasefire, embargo of US arms shipments to Israel, and ceases to give Israel diplomatic cover at the UN. So our strategy is to stop AIPAC and to stop their influence, which means that we want to get members of Congress to take the pledge to reject AIPAC, to say no to AIPAC money, to not accept any funding from AIPAC for their political campaigns, yes to ceasefire, yes to an arms embargo, yes to an exchange of all hostages and prisoners, and yes to equal political and human rights for Palestinians and Israelis. That's what we want from our members of Congress. You've probably seen this, that the campaign that has been that's ongoing about Reject AIPAC, I think there's 12 people there, 12 leaders, and there may be more who have signed on, I'm not sure. But these are the ones who have taken the pledge to reject AIPAC and to reject their funding for their political campaigns. What's on the table now is this joint resolution of disapproval of more arms transfers, which Bernie Sanders and also I think Senator Warren has expressed support for that, right?
I've not heard her say that, no.
Oh, I think I read it.
Okay.
Yeah, and I posted that to the list, yeah. And we need to educate the public and criticize AIPAC's role in organizing support for Israel during the 2025 legislative and 2026 election seasons. So that's what we're aiming for. That's our plan. This webinar is to help us hear the perspectives of our speakers about the campaign, about what AIPAC is doing. How can we sort of stop them? How can we impact and stop their influence on our members of Congress? So we have 4 wonderful speakers today. Ilan Pappe, I think he needs no introduction to this audience. He's a professor at the College of Social Sciences and International Studies at the University of Exeter in the UK. Many of us have read his books, The Ethnic Cleansing of Palestine, Gaza in Crisis, which he wrote with Noam Chomsky, and his most current book, which is most applicable to our conversation today, Lobbying for Israel on Both Sides of the Atlantic. Rami Khouri is an American University of Beirut Distinguished Public Policy Fellow. He is the non-resident senior fellow at the Arab Center of Washington, D.C. Rami, I included this because I thought it was important to honor Anthony Shadid, who was a reporter for the Boston Globe. Rami is the director of the Anthony Shadid Archives Research Project. And Rami's an op-ed contributor to Al Jazeera Online. Many of us have heard Rami speak on Democracy Now! And other programs. Harris Gruman is the executive director of the SEIU Mass State Council, Service Employees International Union. He's the co-leader of Raise Up Massachusetts Coalition, which has been promoting the millionaire's tax. He's the former executive director of Neighbor to Neighbor Mass, and he's a member of MAPA's board. And lastly, Brian Garvey, who's the new executive director of Mass Peace Action, which we are so excited to have him filling that role. And he recently returned from the Democratic National Convention in Chicago, and I think he may share something about that. Okay, those are our speakers. We're going to have them speak one after another. Then we'll open this up for Q&A from you all to get your questions to our speakers. So, Ilan, in your recent book, Lobbying Zionism on Both Sides of the Atlantic, I took this from the blurb describing it, which your book is about how the pro-Israel lobbies have convinced British and American policymakers to condone Israel's flagrant breaches of international law, granting them unprecedented military aid and denying Palestinian rights. And of course, anyone who questioned the unconditional support, even in the mildest terms, became the target of relentless smear campaigns, both in the US and the UK and elsewhere. And what I've just said about people, congressmen in the US. And I know that your 450-page book talks about the unassailable consensus and how it might be dismantled. We're only giving you 15 minutes and an awful lot to talk about, but we're hoping that you could shed light on this issue. So over to you, Ilan. And thank you for being here.
Thank you. Thank you for having me in this webinar and sharing it with wonderful people. One I know, the others, it's a great pleasure to meet you for the first time. And thank you for the people who joined in to listen to us, to engage with us and talk with us. As you mentioned, the book, Lobbying for Zionism, is a very long book. And it's a long book for two main reasons. One, I felt that people do not understand how old, in many ways, the lobby for Zionism is, and the longevity of that lobby, that advocacy, is one of the best explanation for its power, both in Britain and the United States, but its long existence also exposes its weaknesses. Weaknesses that I think we can analyze, and maybe we will succeed in this webinar, at least to shed light on some of them, in order to make the just campaign against AIPAC successful and effective. The second reason I took the liberty of writing rather a long book was I brought many extensive quotes from the various people who were involved in lobbying for Zionism from the very beginning of the project of Zionism in Palestine until today, because the quotes speak for themselves. There's really no need for any sophisticated analysis, and the people are talking in a very explicit way, in a very clear way, and I was astonished in the way they speak, either about the Palestinians or about the Jews, for that matter, and about politics, power, money, extortion, intimidation, and so on. If you just take from the book the direct quotes without any of the narrative that I added to it, you would think that this is a history of a very ruthless mafia rather than a political movement that tries to work for legitimate political interests, both in Britain and the United States. what is important to take from the history of AIPAC, both in Britain and in the United States, is first of all the realization that Zionism began as a Protestant evangelical project long before it was a Jewish one. And that connection between, of course, not all the evangelical Christian streams, but certain streams in evangelical Christianity were behind the very idea that taking over Palestine from the Ottoman Empire at the time and creating there a Jewish state would be is a divine scheme that would precipitate the second coming of the Messiah, the resurrection of the dead, and so on. And this, I don't have to tell it, especially not to the American audience, this idea that supporting Israel is a religious imperative is certainly a very important part of the strengths of the lobby in the United States. Today we call them Christian Zionists. In the past they used to be called the Christian Restorationists, believing that the restoration, as they would call it, of the Jews to Palestine serves a religious purpose. So I think we have to understand that even if we are targeting the methods by which AIPAC is working in order to intimidate and silence those who are willing to speak on behalf of the Palestinians and on behalf of justice in the United States or the United Kingdom, it's important to remember that you're also facing a certain religious dogma, and one that is popular in quite a lot of circles, especially in the United States, but not only in the United States, and not only in Britain. You can find them in Scandinavia, and I even found them among the Christian minority in Malaysia. So this is a powerful alliance. The second point I would like to take from the history that I hope would help us to analyze AIPAC's power today and the way to challenge it is the fact that this is an organization that lies on the shoulders or rests on the shoulders of previous organization. Lobbying for Israel and Zionism did not start with AIPAC. And in fact, most of the methods AIPAC uses were already used by the Zionist lobby in 1900 in Britain, namely the idea that you target politicians at the very early stages of their career when they're not very important and not very significant, and you make sure that they know that you are with them if they support Zionism and later Israel, or they will support your rival if you are not going to abide by their demands and pressure. This didn't work that well in Britain because of the legal system in Britain. The constituency electoral system in Britain doesn't lend itself that easy for such a method. The American political system is ideal for such a tactic, namely the one that says I'm targeting politicians from the very early on, very early stages of their career, and then I don't have to worry too much if when some of them, hopefully from the point of view of the lobby, reach positions of power that can make an impact on the policy towards Israel and Palestine. The third point I would like to mention, and this is sometimes forgotten, I think, in all the discussions about AIPAC, the stress of the webinar, and rightly so, is on the way AIPAC corrupts American politics. But I think there's something which is even more important than that. AIPAC is complicit with the genocide of the people that didn't start on the 7th of October, 2023. AIPAC and the pro-Zionist organization before AIPAC were a very important factor in a project of displacement of the Palestinians and their replacement with Jewish settlers. this is both an original sin, if you want, but it's an ongoing sin. It's more than a sin. It's a crime against humanity. So AIPAC, and I think one of the ways of challenging AIPAC is not only to expose the way, and it does, violates American laws and the way that it influences American national right, or even in the way that it supports Israel. I think it's very important to lay bare the facts that this is an organization that condones and works for a project that has committed crimes against humanity. First in 1948, when the Zionist movement ethnically cleansed Palestine and expelled half of its population, destroyed half of its villages, sorry, and most of its towns, and the incremental ethnic cleansing and genocide that began in 1948 and continues to this very day. Of course, the last year shows that AIPAC is now condoning the most terrible phase in the project of Zionism that has never changed from the very beginning, to try and wipe out the Palestinians, to erase them from history, to erase them geographically. And this is in the 21st century in a country that pretends to be the leading democracy in the world. Another point I think which is very, very important is that when an advocacy group is 100 years old, at least, it begins to maintain a certain identity that sometimes is even separate from the country it was supposed to represent. I show in the book that there were quite a lot of instances when AIPAC decided to attack people, destroy their political career, corrupt the American system, even when it was not asked by Israel to do so. It was seeking power for the sake of power. Whenever there was a sense in AIPAC that there is no total obedience on Capitol Hill, all the ruthless methods of criminal organizations were employed in order to bring people back to the line. In a very good film called The Lobby, not the famous Al Jazeera program, The Lobby. There was an earlier film, less known. There's a kind of a scene that really caught my eye, where Tom Dine, who used to be the vice president of AIPAC, tells that in the early 1990s, he says that it was very important for newcomers to Capitol Hill to be guided through a room that had a door jarred opened, only half opened, so that they could see an AIPAC employee scolding a politician for not towing the AIPAC line. It was a kind of a warning that on Capitol Hill itself, it really, the methods are unbelievable. Tom Dine is important because he left AIPAC, so he's more open in his exposure of the methods that usually are not talked about. Finally, because I have 15 minutes and I don't want to abuse the time, and I think that this is for me is very important. AIPAC thrives in a certain political system. And I don't want to sound pessimistic because it will sound pessimistic, but I'm not, and I'll explain what I mean. I don't think that within the rules of the game of American politics today, there's an effective way of stopping AIPAC. Because the way politics is done, by the way, not only in the United States, the way politics is defined and executed in the global north in particular nowadays is a pursuit of human activity that has very little to do with the real agenda of the people, with the real problems. It's not just that they ignore what the people want the governments to do with regard to Palestine. They ignore what they want, they ignore what the people want the government to do with global warming, with poverty, with injustice, with life seekers who come to the country to seek asylum or life. There's so many issues that politicians today in America and also in the West in general are not representing at all authentically the agenda of most sections in civil society. We used to call a challenge to that kind of politics the left. And I don't care whether we call it today the left or not the left. What is important is to go back to this idea that the politics which are void of any genuine moral values is the politics of our times. And with that environment, AIPAC thrives because it is devoid of any moral backbone. And we should be hopeful that the younger generation in particular offers alternative to what politics mean, what it should be. And I think that with it will also bring the downfall of AIPAC and will also change the global North attitudes towards Palestine and the Palestinians. We already see very positive signs in this direction. The problem is, and with this I would end, that we have two clocks with two different paces at work here. We have the pace of changing the way politics is being done, the public opinion about Palestine, the support in the civil society towards Palestine, and the inability of AIPAC to deal with civil society, because you cannot buy civil society's moral attitudes. You cannot bomb it with F-16. So they're not going to control the change in public opinion, definitely not with the genocide perpetrated by Israel on the ground. But this pace is very slow compared to the pace of destruction. And I want to alert, and I know many of you know it, but I think it's important to articulate it. What Israel is doing today in Gaza is not just genociding the Gaza Strip. It is led by Israeli neo-Zionist messianic leaders who genuinely believe, that this is an historical moment, that they have a window of opportunity that will not repeat itself to wipe out the Palestinians from history and from Palestine. The next stop is already, or the next phase is already taking place in front of our eyes, which is the massive killing of people in the West Bank, massive arrests of people, pushing them out. And the next stage will be the Palestinian community inside Israel. And therefore, we need to narrow the gap between the pace of change of politics and the way it's being done in America and the pace of destruction that Israel is perpetrating. And there's nothing more disappointing, of course, to hear Kamala Harris in Chicago not at all in tune with that scenario, with that reality unfolding on the ground. But it was good to hear the uncommitted representatives in the Democratic Party to understand that there is a different voice there. And I do believe that an international alliance that would change the way we do politics in the world, not only in the United States, would be one of the best antidote to the criminal and ruthless and immoral policies of AIPAC and all the other factors that formally or informally are part of what we can call the pro-Israeli lobby in the United States and beyond. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ilan. Such excellent points. And the point that you expanded, that what AIPAC is doing is actually corrupting the American system, even when it's not asked to do so by Israel, and even beyond just matters of relating to Israel, like they're corrupting the system. Yep. And thank you also to your point about that they are complicit in the genocide, for sure. Super. All right, so let's move on to Rami Khouri. Cole, can you turn off the chat, please? If you haven't.
It's been off, Abby.
Oh, I see. Those messages are coming to me. I apologize. So for those who weren't here at the beginning, I just want to reiterate that Rami is the Distinguished Public Policy Fellow at the American University of Beirut, the non-resident Senior Fellow at the Arab Center in Washington, D.C. So Rami, I actually took something from something that you wrote recently, an article that you wrote. That the pro-Israel lobby AIPAC is growing desperate. That they're finding it harder to confront a growing shift in American opinion on Israel-Palestine, which we've seen in the universities and the encampments across, in different places in the US. And public opinion is no longer as dominantly favorable towards Israel as it used to be, which is worrying the Israeli government and its American supporters. So we would love to hear from you, your perspective on the issues we're discussing. Rami, over to you for 15 minutes.
Thank you very much. Thank you for all the people who are involved in organizing this and participating, and also for all the audience who are watching. This is really an extraordinary moment in the history of the Arab-Israeli conflict, but it's also, I think, an extraordinary moment in the history of the battle against global colonialism. The Gaza uprising and its massive support all over the world, including in the United States, in my view, is the last battle against, the last anti-colonial battle in the world. The British were the great colonial power. There were others, French, Spanish, others, but the British were the most prominent colonial power in the last 200-300 years. And when they started to wane, the Americans took over as the new imperial power. They did imperialism and colonialism in a different way. They didn't physically occupy the lands and kill all the people. They did it by dominating politically and militarily and technologically and in the media. But the events that we're seeing today in the US, in Palestine, and all over the world, to me, are the last struggle for ending the colonial period. The Palestinians are among the last directly colonized people, and they're still being subjected to settler colonial activity in which the Palestinians are being killed and imprisoned and driven out and being replaced by Zionist settlers, Israeli citizens, who are mostly Jews from overseas who come and settle in these new settlements. So I think the magnitude of the events today are way beyond the struggle in Palestine between Zionism first and then Israel and the Palestinian people. So let me make a couple of points to support what I said in that quote you gave me, of mine that you gave. I do believe that AIPAC is really in a desperate situation. They're not showing it. And the way that the Israelis often hide, Zionists and Israelis hide their desperations is by being more violent and being more cruel and being more barbaric, as we're seeing today. And they at the same time stress that they're the most democratic country in the world, etc. The world has finally seen through this charade, this series of lies and exaggerations and distortions. It's become very, very clear that the trend of the last 100 years, because we just passed the 100-year mark in the conflict between what I call Zionism and Palestinian Arabism, or the Arab-Israeli conflict. For 100 years, from the Balfour Declaration, then really from the mandate of 1923 was the year the actual mandate came into effect. But from 1923 to 2023, 24 now, we've had a century. And the Zionism and the State of Israel succeeded beyond their greatest dreams in their colonial mission to turn a land that was 90 to 93% Palestinian Arab into a land that was majority Jewish, now about 80% Jewish. They wanted it to be all Jewish, but they couldn't quite achieve that. But that great success has started to stall and then to fall back. Nobody understands this better than the Zionist movements and AIPAC, which is the leading lobbyist for them in the US. And the biggest sign of this is the fact that they had to spend, I think it was a total of $26 million to overthrow two young Democratic progressive candidates, Khouri Bush and the candidate
Jamal Bowman.
Jamal Bowman. The fact that they had to spend that much money on two primary elections is above all a sign of reckless and extreme desperation. And the reason is because all of their previous tactics, without exception, have either started to be less impactful or have started to be totally irrelevant. And therefore they've leaned back on traditional tactics, of which one really is the most important one, which is to accuse their enemies or people who they think are their enemies or people who they don't want to succeed. They accuse them of being anti-Semitic. That's gone on for 100 years. And it's still very powerful. It's very effective. But even there, some people have been accused of being anti-Semitic, ignore it because it's a lie, and get on with their work. So even the anti-Semitism accusation is not as impactful as it used to be. The other thing that the Zionist movement has always done is to equate the foes of Zionism in the Arab region, the people pushing back against it, initially Palestinians, but then later you had other Arabs involved in it. And now you have some people here in the US and progressive people pushing back against it, to equate them with the most evil thing in the world. In the past, that used to be Hitler, and then it was communism, and then it was radical movements or militant countries like Iraq or Jamal Abdel Nasser, and then it was people like Al-Qaeda or the PLO, and now it's ISIS, and it goes on and on. So if you go back and track Israeli propaganda, pre-state Zionism and then post-state Israeli propaganda, it's constantly changing the personality that it accuses Americans of associating with, personalities around the world that are seen to be the epitome of evil and criminality. That also doesn't work as well as it used to. And the main reason is that people have seen through the image that Israel and Zionists have always projected of the Middle East, of Palestine, and of Israel. And that image, as Ilan shows so well in his book. By the way, I'm reading his book. It's quite an extraordinary volume. It's 450 pages, but I'm about halfway through it, which I'm going to put on my CV as one of my great achievements for this year. But I'll finish it soon. I recommend this book more than any other book I've read in the last 40 years. And I've read most of the books on the Arab-Israeli conflict. This is an extraordinary book by an extraordinary historian and person. And it brings to light all of the facts of the history. And this is a symptom and a symbol of what the AIPAC and its associates are feeling, that they're no longer able to conduct their traditional methods of shaming and negating people in the US or Europe, other places, who are critical of what Israel is doing. There's many reasons for this, and we don't have a lot of time, but I'll just mention a few. By the way, I think the turning point, I've been involved in this. I was born in 48, and I've been involved in engaging with Jewish Americans Israelis, pro-Israeli Americans, evangelicals, all kinds of people. Since I was in college in the US in 1966, right after the 67 war, it started, so I was constantly debating Hillel and Bnei B'rith kids and all kinds of people, and it was fascinating. I learned a lot very quickly. And ever since then, I've been involved with this process. I've documented, not as deeply as Ilan, but I'm in the process of documenting all the major talking points and propaganda lines of the Zionist and then Israeli forces in the world. And I wrote a short article about this on the Arab Center website, if anybody's interested, about 4 or 5 months ago, the Arab Center, Washington. And I'm developing this into a longer study, but all of the points that the Israelis have used and still use today, I've put together. And we can see where the turning point started. I believe, having lived through this and been involved in this process, I believe that it was May, June 2021, when there was the Sheikh Jarrah incident in Jerusalem. The Israelis tried to throw out some Palestinians, take their homes, and then Hamas fired a few rockets at Israel. Israel pummeled Gaza as usual. Palestinians all over the place stood up and spoke in one voice. That was the turning point. And it was because the majority of media around the world, for the first time, started to hear the Palestinians speaking in their own voices, in unison, all over the world, nonstop. That had never happened before. So May, June 2021 was we broke through this system that Zionism and the AIPAC and others had set up that prevented the world from getting the true story. And then, of course, social media kicked in a big way. The alternative media in the US, people like Mondoweiss and The Intercept and Electronic Intifada, and there's this dozen of these really serious websites that give you tremendous information that was never available easily before. And therefore, the consequence has been that all of the major trends that had supported AIPAC's work and the work of Zionism started to crumble, or at least to weaken around the edges, fragment, and then slowly they crumbled. And we see this consequently now in 2024, this incredible movement across the US with young people especially, but not only young people, churches, progressive Jews, labor movements, all kinds of institutions, professional groups that are not willing to see their own country, the United States, complicit in the worst genocide of the last 50 years, or at least the last genocide that we could see in real time happening. There are other genocides that happened in Rwanda and other places. So this is to me, the biggest sign of change that has started to happen, that Israel could no longer pass along these lies and fabrications and exaggerations. And in the chronology of the different techniques that Zionism used in its propaganda, there was 3 or 4 critical ones. They would say absolute fabrications, lies. They would exaggerate things. They would talk about things that aimed mainly to change the subject to something else. And then they would make accusations to try to denigrate the identity or credibility of those people it didn't like American progressive politicians or others. So all of that started to wither in the last few years, but in the last 2 years, or since 2021, or 3 years, we've seen a much faster push for the weakening of the impact of the Zionist lobby and strengthening of many other forces around the world. The thing that AIPAC, Ilan mentioned that AIPAC and Zionism have tried from the very beginning, way back, going back to 1910, 1920, they wanted to make the Palestinians invisible people, that they didn't exist. And they said that this was an empty land. Of course, it wasn't. That was one of their first lies. And they tried to make the Palestinians invisible. Today, they can't do that anymore. So what they're trying to do today is to make them criminal, that being Palestinian is a criminal enterprise. And anybody who supports them is a supporter of Hamas and a supporter of ISIS. And so this is a really important turning point, because the basis, that the fundamental foundation that allows AIPAC to do what it does, which Ilan documents so well in his book, is no longer as effective as it used to be. And there are now dozens of Arab, American, Palestinian, European institutions of law who will take people to court for doing something that used to be basic AIPAC work, today is seen as illegal and against American law, against American principles. And you see signs of the pushback against Zionism and Israel because of the genocide. Now, the main reason is now the genocide, but even before the genocide, we saw hints of this. But it's now going much, much faster.
Rami, can I give you another minute or so?
Yes, and therefore now we're seeing the great convergence of many different forces and groups all around the world simply seeking justice for Israelis and Palestinians. And you're getting even the AIPAC and the others going desperately saying that when you wear a keffiyeh, that you're trying to destroy kill all the Israelis. I mean, this kind of absolute wild nonsense, gibberish, is taken seriously by the mainstream American press. And so this is a tremendously important moment when the forces of change have started to happen. The institutions that would need to support it, like legal institutions, the International Court of Justice and others, have kicked in. But there's one missing element. The Palestinians don't have a leadership. We do not have a government. We are not invisible, but we're leaderless. Our government has been co-opted by Israel and others. And this is the great turning point that we have to look for next, which is the Palestinians converging. They're working on it now. There's meetings all the time to create a credible new legitimate government and then engage the world and engage the Israelis. And I repeat, with the ultimate aim of coexisting where the Jewish people of Israel have their rights and the Palestinians have their rights. But this is a profoundly important moment, and the change is just starting. And what I learned from the 60s to now, watching US politics, is that activism can happen quickly. You can have marches, you can have protests, you can have this, but policy change takes a long time. But we've started to see the policy change, glimmers of it starting to take place in some discussions. So I'll stop there. And thank you very much again for having me.
Thank you so much, Rami. Excellent, excellent points that you made. Thank you so much for that. Our next, and thank you for making the links to Ilan's points about the tactics that the lobby has been using. So we've heard a lot about tactics, and our next speaker, Harris Gruman, I think knows something about these kind of tactics. So I'm going to, Harris, I'm just going to give you, let's see, there you are. I'm just going to cue this up a minute. So for people who didn't hear the introduction to Harris Gruman, he's the executive director of the SCIU, Service Employees International Union, Massachusetts State Council. So Harris, I think we understand that you've seen some of these tactics that AIPAC uses, I believe, in the labor movement. And Rami made an interesting point about just now about the labor movement, that there is a movement among the labor movement to who are now aware of what's happening in Israel and Palestine. And these kind of McCarthyite tactics that we're hearing, and Ilan mentioned this, targeting politicians at early stages of their career. Rami said, calling them anti-Semitic, equating foes to Hitler. So I think you know about this. So we're going to turn this over to you. Thank you, Harris.
Well, thank you very much, Abby. I really appreciate that. And yes, I think there's a lot of things to unpack here, but I'll try to be brief. And I do want to start with Ilan's absolutely key point, which is that the political system in the United States is failing to respond to the agenda of the people. I mean, it's as big as that. It's a very big problem. And it's what empowers a group like AIPAC to have the incredible, manipulative power they have to change things that aren't even about Israel or what's going on between Israel and Palestine, but have to do with what a union like mine is working for. Now, I represent in Massachusetts 120,000 workers. I serve at their pleasure, and they are mostly care workers, direct care workers. The biggest group being home care for senior citizens with illnesses and people with disabilities, but also child care workers, people work in group homes with mental health issues and children and families and the substance abuse problems and so on. So, we are really, a union that's very much, and we have 2 million members nationwide who mostly do this kind of work. People really on the front lines of dealing with care and dealing with human beings as human beings. And so how could we not be against war? I mean, that is absolutely the antithesis of what our members do and what they, what they believe in. So I think it's important to note that right from the outset, because this is the last 4 years have been very disturbing for our union, I think. One is that we elected a president who came in very committed to making a gigantic investment in care work, in home care, child care. And we're talking about over $500 billion investment. That was the Build Back Better legislation. We all know that that was held up, blocked, and basically defeated by a bipartisan effort to undermine it. That in itself, I found myself apologizing for constantly because, we know how our system works. You could say how our system is broken and how undemocratic it is because of the Electoral College, the powers of senators, the filibuster, and so on. But what happened that was most disturbing was that a year later, this administration essentially declared war, Cold War, admittedly, on 3 big powers out there in the world, the 2 of them, the biggest nuclear powers, one Russia, the other China, and the third Iran. And this for me, this whole Israel-Palestine thing is ensconced in this war in the Middle East, you could call it, just like we have a war in Eurasia and we have a war in the South China Sea right now. They are cold wars, but they could heat up very fast, and people are dying very visually and vividly in 2 of them already, and that's unacceptable. So we have an atmosphere that goes along with that. You mentioned that, Abby, the McCarthyist atmosphere. I'd like to just share something almost what started out as a kind of ludicrous example, I thought, because this is just a day ago in the New York Times. Activists charged with pushing Russian propaganda go on trial in Florida. Now, this is a group called the African People's Socialist Party. And, I think, well, these poor benighted, leftists, marginalized leftists, are being put on trial. I thought on the paper copy, which I still read, it didn't have this subtitle you see on the screen, which I'll get to in a second. And so I thought it was an article sympathetic to them, that they were being bullied and treated unfairly by investigators just to intimidate them. It turned out, especially when you look at the way it's published online, the paper actually takes it extremely seriously, what the investigation is. It says, experts say the case offers a window into how the Russian government tries to influence American elections and promote its own geopolitical agenda. Well, if this is how they're doing it through a group like the African People's Socialist Party in, ironically, St. Petersburg, Florida, not St. Petersburg, Russia, they're not doing a very good job of influencing anything. I mean, I've been in much bigger left-wing groups than that, and we've had very little influence. But the interesting thing about this is they're taking that seriously and presenting it as a serious problem. And so today, in the paper, they have a much more extensive example, this Tenet website that publishes right-wing Trumpist bloggers, and they say, they have these opinions too about Russia and whatever. I mean, the message of all of that is very clear. They're saying if you agree with any of this, you must be a witting or unwitting dupe of a foreign power. Now, that one is worth, this one I just showed, is worth, I don't know, thousands of dollars of geopolitical money. But the one they talked about today was worth $10 million, apparently, of funding basically Trumpist bloggers to do what they'd already written, not to do anything new. Okay, we started this with how much AIPAC influences American politics, over $100 million in 1 year alone. Now, these things don't get put on the same page in the paper. I mean, they're not juxtaposed as something similar. And so I would like to almost say that there's something very strange going on where misinformation, as it's called, and a lot of it is promoted in very different ways, but it's being partisan separated, so that you could say that there's a kind of cover up of the whole militarization of our society that's been going on over the last couple of years. I mean, basically, you have the arms industry and groups like AIPAC influencing our politics profoundly at huge levels of input of resources, and it's not discussed. So let's turn again to these cases: Khouri Bush, Jamal Bowman. I could go back also to Donna Edwards. Donna Edwards was an African-American member of Congress that SEIU worked very hard to elect. She ran for Senate and no longer held the seat. And when she tried to get the seat back in 2018, I believe it was, she was soundly defeated by a major investment by AIPAC. And then again, Jamal Bowman and Khouri Bush recently both lost because of a major impact. I mean, millions of dollars in each of those races. And that's really influence in American electoral politics. And what's upsetting is that, okay, they're focused on this very narrow agenda, they would say, but it isn't a narrow agenda. It's part of a general, you could call it the military-industrial complex. And what they're defeating is the people's agenda. Because when SEIU backs those folks and wins those elections, we're doing it for the care economy. We're doing it for healthcare, for childcare, for affordable housing. We're doing it to fight poverty. And as Ilan said, the two big issues, climate change and poverty. Those are the things that are not getting the attention they urgently need. Climate change could be existential and apocalyptic. And then, of course, anti-militarism is also apocalyptic and existential because we're risking nuclear war in 3 sections of the world right now. And again, that's all happening kind of offline. And you could say, yes, we have MAGA, which is a very big threat. And, Donald Trump is kind of crazy, but he's also a bit of a boogeyman because there's also a kind of blue MAGA, which is, or maybe we call it a bipartisan MAGA, which is Make America Great Again. And that is the imperial agenda. And that is an agenda that is for making money on war and not making money on care. And it really comes down to, we say at SEIU, there's sort of 2 choices in every federal budget. You fund Medicaid or the military. I mean, those are, the Medicaid obviously is a kind of a stand-in for all the anti-poverty work and healthcare work and educational work, but it is the biggest federal budget piece of that. So we say Medicaid versus military spending. And those are the hard choices people have to make. And AIPAC is playing a very powerful role within an extremely powerful and structural system that favors, unfortunately, the heavy industries of the arms manufacturers and not the people. And so I'll leave it at that for now. We could go on forever about it, but it is leading to also a growth of McCarthyism across our political spectrum, I would say.
That's superb. Thank you, Harris. Cole, before you remove the spotlight, thank you for making the connection between what AIPAC is doing and the other, they're not movements, but people who are, people who are opposed to the care economy, who are supporting militarism, who are not putting forward the people's agenda, which, as you said, Ilan made that point, and you're making it so important. And this idea about what all three of you have spoken about influencing American electoral politics. And so what this webinar is about is this struggle against AIPAC and the lobby is also a struggle for the democracy of the United States. Super. Thank you so much, Harris. So our last speaker is Brian Garvey, who is the new incoming and new executive director of MAPA. Everyone, please applaud. Congratulations, Brian, for coming in. We know you were just at the DNC last week or so, and so tell us, what are you thinking about this struggle we're having?
Well, thank you for the kind introduction, and all of the presentations so far have been right on point. I'll just add, we have been talking about this acceleration of interference in American elections by AIPAC to oust some very important progressive politicians. This is really a continuation in this cycle of something that's been going on for a long time, which was mentioned. And I want to mention one other politician, Andy Levin, from Michigan, just north of Rashida Tlaib's district, who was perhaps the most progressive Jewish voice in Congress. And due to a mountain of money inserted into that race, he lost his seat as well. And he was critical of Israeli policy and US policy in relation to it. And even he was accused of anti-Semitism, although I believe he is or was the president of his synagogue for a time. So just goes to show how out of control this lobby is. So if you'll bear with me, I'll just share my screen. I do want to tell you a little bit about in Chicago at the DNC. Can everybody see my screen all right?
Yeah.
Okay, great. Because I think AIPAC had a lot to do with not only the movement in the street, as you'll hear from some of the activists themselves, but the reaction from the Democratic politicians at the DNC. So these were the main questions that activists wanted to know, really spelled out succinctly in this gentleman's sign. Dissatisfaction with Joe Biden's facilitation and complacency and complicity with the genocide in Gaza, and wanting to know, is this just a different name, a different face, a different person up for the nomination, or are the policies going to change? So here's a video with some of the folks that we were with. This gentleman is from Chicago area Peace Action, about what we were doing there, the demands of activists. Massachusetts Peace Action has made the trek to Chicago. I see that the sound is not being shared. So if you'll...
It sounded fine, Brian.
I heard it.
Okay, good. I just couldn't hear it on my end, but that's all right. We'll get back into it. Massachusetts Peace Action has made the trek to Chicago.
Ceasefire, obviously, and an arms embargo.
A coalition of American Jews fighting to end the apartheid in Israel and Palestine.
We don't want a genocide to continue in Gaza.
U.S. claims that it wants a ceasefire, but then continues to send $20 billion of weapons. So many amazing people are out here, and I think we're coming from a lot of different political spectrums, but we're united on wanting to stop this genocide. Massachusetts Peace Action has made the trek to Chicago.
Ceasefire.
Sorry, just forgive me for one moment. And I think this bears repeating. I know it was mentioned earlier on in the program, but that $20 billion sale right now is being opposed We are expecting a joint resolution of disapproval to be filed by Senator Sanders at any time now. And we are hoping here in Massachusetts, but all across the country, to get as many senators and their colleagues in the House to step up and say, we blocked this. These are weapon sales that are enabling a genocide, and the Congress should not support it. This reflects the majority position of the American people. Overwhelming amount of Democrats, but independents and even Republicans are saying that they no longer support this blanket sending of weapons to Israel. Now, we set up a very easy action. This will allow you to send messages to your members of Congress, and you can write down this link, but we'll also send it to you in a follow-up, and we'll put it in the chat. So you don't need to scramble at this moment. But senators and your member in the House need to hear that you expect them to block this sale. Now, the good thing about this joint resolution of disapproval related to this arms sale is it has privilege in the Senate, which means they can't just quietly kill it. It will get a vote on the floor. So at the very least, every member of the United States Senate will have to sign their name on one side or the other. Do they support sending or selling $20 billion worth of weapons to Israel in the midst of their genocide on Gaza? So these next two activists that I spoke with are members of the Uncommitted movement, Jewish Americans who were talking about why it was important to them to be at the DNC protesting and calling for a ceasefire now, and really talking about how their demands have evolved over the course of this onslaught on Gaza that we've seen. In their own words, here it is.
So Not Another Bomb is calling for an arms embargo. They're trying to make that into policy within the Biden-Harris administration. Without the Uncommitted movement, we would not have had a change in the Democratic ticket. It is because of the work of the Uncommitted movement that Biden realized he needed to step aside. Our Reject AIPAC movement, which is seeking to get AIPAC money out of our democracy. AIPAC is just as toxic to politicians as the NRA. So Not Another Bomb is calling for an arms embargo. They're trying to make that.
And I'll just say that I think that that evolution of the demands from protesters from many organizations, but especially this new iteration of the Uncommitted movement, which got over 700,000 votes across the country. About 60,000 people in Massachusetts voted no preference. The evolution from this idea that we need to work towards a two-state solution, and that's going to solve this problem, to we need a ceasefire now to stop the carnage immediately, to stop this war dead in its tracks. I think that has been adopted by the Democratic Party in a way that has distracted and has not been honest. We've heard from Secretary of State Tony Blinken that a ceasefire is just weeks away, just days away, and we've heard that many times over almost the last year. And I think in reaction to that, and very appropriately, the demand has evolved to a demand for not another bomb and for an arms embargo, to really say that we're not going to facilitate the behavior of the Israeli government anymore. We've seen what they're capable of. We have seen what they do with American weapons. So ceasefire, while incredibly necessary, is no longer enough. American taxpayers no longer want their names or their money associated with the Israeli military and what it has done to the people of Gaza, what it's now doing to the people in the West Bank, and threatening to expand this war into Lebanon, into Iran, and further. Just as a side note, this is also an installation that we put up. I think it connects quite well with some of the things that Harris was talking about, the choices that we make between care and war. We went to Chicago and put up this art installation several times, including at the large protests. This is 75 yards long, and it represents U.S. military spending, which, as you can see from the chart on your left, at $921 billion equals the spending of the next 9 countries combined. And as I'm sure many of you noticed, most of those, with the exception of China and Russia, are U.S. allies.
Super.
So it really is a choice. And I'll finish up here. I know we're short on time, Abby, but as I'm sure many of you heard, because they did get in the media, the uncommitted delegates held a sit-in the night and all through the night before Thursday, when VP Kamala Harris accepted the nomination. And their demand was very simple at that moment, saying that they wanted a Palestinian American to have some stage time, to have 2 or 3 minutes on stage at the National Convention. This is a convention that was 4 days, about 6 or 7 hours a day, that champions diversity. And in Chicago, the city with the largest Palestinian American population in America, they refused Palestinian American simply 2 or 3 minutes to talk about the war in Gaza and their perspective. And even folks who are elected officials in swing states, a Palestinian American woman who is a member of the House at the State House in Georgia was refused a speaking spot. And if you just have 1 more minute, here's the perspective of one of the folks that sat in, a woman from Code Pink. What's your frustration level with the Democratic
I'm heartbroken, you know, and like having been through that with them, that could cost my allegiance, absolutely, because it's such a minimal request, and the thing that is at stake for them is so high. The story that I heard was that they'd offered option after option, candidate after candidate for a speaker, and they were all ruled out. They weren't given explanations as to why. They were listing off the things that did get representation. Donald Trump's press secretary, Burr, was up there. Palestine's a big deal. I have a cold feeling about trying to hide that in any way. Like, really watching them empathetically would be inconsistent with the vote for the Democratic Party.
Super. Thank you, Brian.
Yep, and that's where it stands now. The hand has been offered to the Democratic Party, and we await a change in more than just rhetoric, a change in policy.
Super. Thank you. Thank you. That was excellent. And this connection that all of our speakers have made between the money that's being spent, the incredible amounts of money that are being spent on bombs and arms, and the taking money from childcare, housing, education, healthcare, all of that, which is just unconscionable. So I think our speakers have outlined the work ahead of us. And now we have time for Q&A. We're going to ask you to post your questions in the chat box so that we can easily identify questions from, you know, sort of textual entries. If you wouldn't mind posting your question in the chat, and we'll take it and we'll pose it to our speakers. We have one more? No, that's it, right? Okay, and then I think Lorena.
Okay, here comes Rami.
Are you adding Lorena also?
Am I? I can if you wish.
Please, yeah. So Ilan, a question for you. How does AIPAC violate US law, if you're able to speak to that?
Yes, definitely. The US law does not allow a foreign country to lobby it's against the American regulation. This was already exposed by Senator Fulbright in 1962 when he found out that, and AIPAC has been doing this for a long time. What AIPAC does, it pretends to recruit money for impoverished sections of the Israeli Jewish society. The money goes to Israel, but doesn't stay in Israel. Much of it goes back to fund AIPAC's actions in the United States, which are illegal. They also sell products and so on in order to fund their own activity. You're not allowed to do it according to the American law. But since Senator Fulbright tried to have a hearing in Congress about it, he paid with his political career. And ever since that, I think nobody dares to take this to the Foreign Affairs Committee or to any other media. But I do think that if a group of lawyers in America would take this as a challenge, it's very clear. I'm not a legal expert, but from what I hear, this could be a very effective and important part of the struggle against AIPAC, because it is violating the basic American regulations of advocacy for a foreign country, which is seen as undermining the American national interest.
That's superb. We should be adding that to our list of tactics, I think, right?
I do think so.
Yeah. Lorena?
We have a question here from Jennifer. I think she said to anyone. Can anyone speak to how AIPAC has influenced school curriculum and about the Arab-Israel conflict?
What was the question again? How AIPAC what?
Can anyone speak to how AIPAC has influenced school curriculum in the Arab-Israel conflict?
I can make a comment on that.
Thank you.
You have situations all over the country where local groups are very active. You have to remember that AIPAC has been successful not only because it had prominent national leaders, wealthy donors, people who sit on board of trustees of universities, sort of top-down impact. They've also had impact mainly because they organized at the community level in much of their activity. And this means that, and I've experienced this now for the first time directly here in the Boston area where I live, where whenever there's a major activity or minor activity that's going to talk about Palestine in some way, and may not even be talking, critically about Zionism, could be just talking about Palestinian art or something like that. You get local groups who contact local officials, could be the mayor's office, could be the public library, could be the police, could be the media. Local people who say, oh, this is dangerous, we better get some police protection, without any basis in reality. And they do the same thing with the schools. They contact the libraries. When schools want to put on events, they say, look, this is going to be dangerous. These people are Hamas supporters. I mean, much of what they say is untrue, unverified, with no evidence. But because the general atmosphere that AIPAC and the groups before it successfully created in the US starting 100 years ago is that Israel is a vibrant democracy that made the desert bloom, that treats its women well, et cetera, et cetera. The general atmosphere is still to think of Israelis well and to think of Palestinians as dangerous people. So we still have to deal with that lasting effect. And even if you're telling a lie, if you go to your public school and say, look, this book that you have in the library here by this guy, Ilan Pappe, or somebody else, this is really very anti-Israeli, and we don't think it's right for an American school to have this book, the school will probably take it out. But the antidote to that is, which Ilan mentioned indirectly, which I believe very strongly, and I think I mentioned it briefly in my comments, is legal action. The United States is a country of laws, even though rich white men have more rights under the law than poor black women, but still it's a country of law. And if you push hard enough, you can get the law to be implemented, especially if you have local support.
Yeah.
And I think what we're seeing with the boycott movement, where some legal action has been taken to push back against attempts by the Israel lobby to make it a crime to support BDS, the Boycott, Divestment, Sanctions movement, that has been overturned in many, many cases. Not everyone, but many. So legal action remains a critical weapon that can be used. And in school cases, it's not just what they do in their curriculum, it's what they do in their public activities, guest speakers that they have. I've spoken at many schools, in the high schools and colleges, and I always have my friends tell me, oh, and we mentioned your name, they weren't sure and they needed to be careful that you weren't going to say crazy stuff against Israel. And I say, I am going to say stuff against Israel, but it's not going to be crazy, it's going to be factual.
Yeah.
And so the long answer to your short question is there's many ways in which local activists influence local institutions.
Thank you, Rami. Michael is asking, to what degree is the US in charge rather than Israel in this genocide? Is Israel really in charge through their control over Congress? Ilan, want to take that one?
Yes. Well, I think that it's a nuanced analysis here is quite important, but one that can be done. It is the Israeli pilots and the Israeli soldiers who man the tanks, the Israeli special units who are doing the massive killing themselves. Now, in many cases, they use American weapons for this mass killing. So you can see that there is a American complicity in this, as well as the understanding who is exactly committing the crimes, not American soldiers or pilots, but American weapons are used for it. Then there is the more indirect complicity, by which America blocks actions by bodies such as the International Court of Justice and the ICC that suggested very effective ways of at least stopping the genocide, and America is blocking it, as it blocked several United Nations resolutions. So it's important not to do it in a slogan or in a soundbite. It's very easy to list very clearly what is the American role in it, and alongside that, the Israeli role in it. And finally, I would say on this, without American military support, without American financial support, without American diplomatic force, Israel could not have done such a massive actions of, could not have perpetrated such a massive genocide as it does now. It would have been much more limited. Think about the way that the United States tries to deter Hezbollah in the north, that all Hezbollah is doing and saying very clearly to the Israelis, stop the genocide, and we're stopping our actions. And the Israelis feel that this is not a deterrence because the United States has sent its navy to the Eastern Mediterranean to show the Israelis that they have an extra army if they need it. And that's a great pity because the Israelis' limitation as a military force are very clear in 2024. You take the United States out of the equation, and Israel would not be able to deal with the pressures from the region. And maybe we can avoid a military confrontation in order to persuade it to change its policy if it would be persuaded that the balance of power is against it. But while America puts all its weight on Israel's side, Israeli policymakers would always think that worse comes to worse, America has our back. And that's another layer of the complicity.
Yeah, thank you. Harris, go ahead.
Yeah, well, to tie it back to something I said before, too, I mean, I do think America has a role that's, you know, in some ways, the Gaza situation and the Netanyahu government are both terrible embarrassments to this administration. I don't know if maybe they wouldn't be embarrassments to Trump, but at least to the Biden-Harris administration, they're not things that they want to be associated with. But they do want to be associated with containing Iran. And that's how I think we've gotten involved in this thing again. I mean, we've been involved since the beginning, but I mean, once again, we are reiterating our role as a kind of master, you know, arbiters of the Middle East. And part of that is a reaction to China trying to play that role with Yemen, you know, and trying to broker between Iran and Saudi Arabia. Our reaction to that was to double down on a military alliance between Saudi Arabia, Israel, and the United States, which of course heated up the temperature in that region. One could argue it caused the attack, you know, that the attack was a response to the sense of being encircled by Saudi Arabia abandoning the Palestinian cause. I don't know, you know, I'm not the expert. I'm here to learn more than probably to say, because I'm in the company of very expert folks here. But I do think that the Iran situation is kind of the backdrop. You know, there's always this bigger geopolitical thing going on. And I think we have to keep that in mind. So we end up becoming complicit because we have goals that then are aligned with Israel's goals or Netanyahu's goals, if you want to narrow it down to that.
Yeah, great point, Harris. Thank you. So first of all, we are at 2:30, and I just want to check with our speakers. Are you available to go 10 or 15 minutes longer to answer people's questions? 10, Ilan says 10. Rami says 10. Okay, so 10 minutes. Thank you. Harris, you good with that? Harris and Brian? Okay, 10 minutes. So Lorena, you have the next question?
Yes, we had a couple similar questions here, so I'll be reading the one from Tina. Why can't the US register AIPAC as a foreign agent? Would that not diminish completely their influence on the politicians?
Yes, that's that was the demand from Fulbright in '62 until today, that they would register as a foreign agent. The moment they're registered as a foreign agent, they have to report and explain what kind of resources they are recruiting and for what purpose, in terms, in a way that would show that they're not trying to influence the American policy. Now, of course, they don't want to be exposed to this kind of examination under the American law, so they refused from the day they're officially open in '54 until today. And every powerful senator, and I mentioned Fulbright, but he was not the only one, who wanted to force them to register as a foreign agent, lost his political career and her political career in later cases. It's quite incredible. It's quite incredible. If you demand to register AIPAC as a foreign agent in the United States, you will be immediately targeted by AIPAC as the worst kind of anti-Semite that ever existed. This is the fact that the American mainstream media accept this as a normal kind of engagement between an advocacy group and its own lawmakers is incredible. It's been going on for 75, 76 years now. Quite incredible.
Yep.
I can just add a little touch to that. I wonder all the time, as I watch this process happen over my whole adult lifetime watching this, I wonder how much, and this is a question, how much the actions of AIPAC and the Israeli government and their supporters here to make the well-being of Israel as it defines itself the litmus test of anything that you do in the United States. If you're giving a course at a university, if you're giving a lecture, if you're a hotel hosting an Arab cultural dinner, anything that you do is almost having to do with the Middle East is going to be measured against the well-being of Israel as AIPAC defines that process. And I wonder if that is not also contributing to greater irritation with Israel and therefore possibly contributing to greater anti-Semitism in its traditional form of people who say, look, these Israelis, these Jews, they're trying to, make us do anything they want. And again, I ask this as a question. It strikes me as it's probably bad for Israel in the long run, and we may be seeing it in the changes in the public opinion surveys that we see, where support for Palestinians is growing, support for Israel is declining, and there's more even-handed position. Maybe it's a reaction to the Israelis overdoing it. And it's because they're in the public eye for the first time. Zionism's success was that it did all of its lobbying in quiet government offices in London and Washington and New York. They were not wildly lobbying in public. They were having rallies for, cultural dinners for Jews, but their lobbying was done in private, quietly, behind closed doors, with individual people. They didn't target mass groups. Now their situation is being discussed in public, and they don't like it. They don't like public discussion. They refuse to have debates about issues. They like to make accusations. Again, from my 50 years of doing this, they refuse to have public debates about the issues. They just want to make accusations and then, try to shut you off balance. And then when I run into people like this at lectures, universities, or wherever, I say, let's have a discussion about this next week. They refuse to do it because they don't want the realities of Israel and its history to be raised for public discussion. And this is why they're trying to shut down now these Palestinian voices.
Right. Thank you. And I think that gets back to our tactics to make this public, to educating the public and putting it out there so that people know. And I think to some extent, the activists have been successful at the universities, at the encampments, and so forth. All right, we might have time for one or two more. This seems like an important point to me, that that AIPAC targets the Black candidates using Christian Zionism and the Black church. Wonder, Ilan, do you want to just comment on that for a minute?
Yes, definitely. For many years, AIPAC and even the wider informal pro-Israeli lobby assumed that the kind of Christianity that evolves in African-American centers is a safeguard for a religious even support by African-Americans for Israel, even equating the Jews with slavery and the African victimization of African Americans. Now, what AIPAC woke up a bit late in the day to the movements such as Black Lives Matters, and even before that to activism that is so beautifully personified by Angela Davis and other African Americans who have always been very vocal in their support for the Palestinians. I think it was a bit of off the radar for them. So now they're trying to target African Americans as potential allies of the Palestinians, which in the past they didn't think they had to bother with, and they do it very brutally and very ruthlessly. And again, it comes back to the point that also Harris made. The whole way the American political field is working by buying success with money, by ignoring agendas of the inner cities, of poverty, public health. AIPAC is on the side of the establishment that perpetuates social injustice, economic injustice, immoral American imperialist foreign policy, And I think we have to stress this, that it's a very important lobby, not just for Israel. It's a very important lobby for domestic and foreign policies of the United States, which most Americans with a modicum of decency in them find abhorrent and unacceptable. The American political system does not allow for these voices to be far more represented in Congress. It's a very weird political, I don't have to tell you, you're Americans, you're aware of your very bizarre political electoral system. But I think that even with that electoral system, things will change. But as I said in my talk, we need to find a way of accelerating this change, because the neo-Zionist messianic politicians of Israel are accelerating their own acts of destruction. So we need to find a way of narrowing the gap between our success in the US and their unfortunate success on the ground in Palestine.
Yeah, thank you. I think one last question. Lorena, there's a question from Ziba, which seems kind of important. Go ahead.
Yes, that's the one I had here ready to read to. Can you clarify what the filing of the joint resolution of disapproval will achieve? Elizabeth Warren said they only have a handful of senators that will support conditioning aid or enforcing our laws. Also, what effect do you believe that withholding arms will have on Israel? It seems like they are not going to willingly stop killing and detaining Palestinians or expanding settlements and terrorizing the population of the West Bank. So someone is going to have to force that to happen. Curious what levers you think will make this happen. Divestment, arms embargo?
Brian, you want to take that?
Well, yeah.
Oh, sorry.
No, Brian.
Just in brief.
No, Brian, go on.
Thank you. I think all of the above in terms of what is necessary to actually make it happen. I firmly believe that this conflict will not be solved until the United States takes its thumb off the scale. As someone mentioned before, Israeli decision makers know that as long as US politicians, including nominally progressive ones, are saying things like there's no daylight between the US and Israeli positions, that they have carte blanche to continue on with their behavior. To get to the joint resolution of disapproval, I think it's important to put the politicians on the record here, because I do think attitudes are changing, especially among young people. And I believe it will change, and support for Palestine and opposition to what Israel is doing will become a core progressive value. And we need to have those folks on the record, because I think it's becoming more obvious what is being done, the ethnic cleansing in Gaza. Some of these politicians are going to try and run away from this and say, I didn't know, that wasn't to do with me, I voted on it for other reasons. So if we can hang this around their necks and say, no, you supported this, you own it, and you be judged on it in your next election, I think that in and of itself, getting them on the record is helpful.
Anyone want to add to that? No, you're good? Okay, so first of all, I want to thank our speakers. Thank you so very much for coming, for speaking to us about this issue, for expressing your, passion about this, your dedication to helping us overturn what AIPAC is doing, undermining our democracy. There is nothing more important of course, we want to end the killing in Gaza and the West Bank, and we also want to save our democracy in the US. Before you all leave, I want you to see people thanking you for being here. So I'm just going to remove the spotlight, and I'm going to ask our participants to voice your appreciation either in the chat or verbally. Cole, if we can unmute people. But could you all show your appreciation here? If you change to if our speakers can change to gallery and just
thank you.
Thank them.
Thank you so much. Wonderful.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank
you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you all for coming. I'm sorry we couldn't get to
Thank you.
questions. We will send a follow-up email to you all. Thank you, Ilan Pappe, Rami Khouri, Harris Gruman, and Brian Garvey.
Thank you.
So much.
Thank you all. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ilan.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rami.
Thank you. I may.
Thank
Thank
you,
you.
especially to Ilan and Rami.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Yes,
Thank you.
thank you.
fantastic.
Thank you.
This is so important.
Thank you so much, all of you. Thank you. Thank you.
Great day.